Hey guys, tonight we begin with the divine rebranding and cosmic corporate merger that is ancient Roman mythology. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's begin with the Roman pantheon, the ancient gods of a deeply practical people. These weren't the wild, passionate, and frankly, emotionally unstable deities of the Greeks. The Roman gods were more like a celestial board of directors for the greatest, most ambitious startup in the ancient world, the Roman Republic, and later, the Empire. They were gods with a purpose, with a strong sense of duty, and with a portfolio of responsibilities that aligned perfectly with the strategic interests of Rome. They were, in essence, the Greek gods. But after they'd been acquired by a major corporation, given new Latin names, and told to focus on the key performance indicators of piety, gravity, and the expansion of the state. Their days were spent managing the cosmos, which mostly involved overseeing treaties, protecting the legions, and ensuring the sacred hearth of the city never went out. No spontaneous transformations into swans, no petty squabbles that resulted in a 10-year war. Well, fewer of them anyway. They were, in essence, a more serious, more dignified, and frankly, more boring version of their Greek predecessors. Imagine being a god of wild, chaotic passion, and then your new job description says your primary role is to embody pietas, a sense of dutiful respect for the gods, the state, and the family. To keep things running smoothly, the Roman gods had their own hierarchy, a clear chain of command that mirrored the structure of the Roman state. Think of them like divine magistrates and senators. Their power derived not just from raw, primordial force, but from their official position within the cosmic order. At the top was the Capitoline triad, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, the senior executive team who held their board meetings in a great temple on the Capitoline Hill. Yes, the same group who later became the official state deities, their worship a matter of patriotic duty. Workplace drama was still present, but it was less about personal grievances and more about the fate of Rome itself. But it gets weirder. At some point, the Romans, in their relentless and practical expansion, began to absorb the gods of the peoples they conquered, a process called syncretism. It was a divine mergers and acquisitions strategy. Why? Because the Romans understood that you don't just conquer a people's land, you have to manage their spiritual assets. Ungrateful mortals in a newly acquired province might get restless if their local god was fired. So the Romans mostly just identified the local deity with one of their own, gave them a new title, and absorbed them into the ever-expanding corporate pantheon. Ah, Rome, the civilization that treated its mythology like it treated everything else, with a genius for organization, a deep respect for tradition, and the ruthless, practical efficiency of an empire on the rise. Let's talk about Jupiter, or Iupiter Optimus Maximus, the best and greatest, the king of the gods, the ruler of the sky, and the divine equivalent of a powerful, stern, and deeply respected Roman paterfamilias, who also happens to be the CEO of the entire universe. If the Roman pantheon was a cosmic senate, Jupiter was its most powerful and authoritative consul. He was, of course, the Roman version of the Greek god Zeus, but he'd traded in much of Zeus's wild, chaotic energy for a heavy dose of Roman gravitas. He wasn't just the god of thunder and lightning. He was the god of law, of justice, of oaths, and of the state. He was less of a capricious, philandering monarch and more of a divine chief magistrate. His lightning bolt less a weapon of personal pique and more the ultimate symbol of divine, legal authority. He was, in essence, Zeus, after he'd gone to law school, passed the bar, and been elected to the highest office in the cosmos. His primary role was as the protector and guarantor of Rome itself, the great temple of Jupiter. Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill was the center of Roman religious and political life. It was here that generals came to give thanks after a victory, that new consuls took their vows, and that the most important treaties were signed. His worship wasn't just a matter of personal piety. It was a patriotic duty. To honor Jupiter was to honor the power, the majesty, and the destiny of Rome. He was the ultimate divine patriot, the celestial embodiment of Roman power. While Zeus was constantly meddling in the lives of mortals for his own amusement and romantic pursuits, Jupiter's interventions were usually more serious, more state-focused. In the Aeneid, he is the great, steady hand of fate, the one who ensures that despite the petty squabbles of the other gods, Aeneas will fulfill his destiny and lay the groundwork for Rome. He's less of a participant in the drama and more of a cosmic judge, ensuring that the grand, historical project of Rome stays on track. Of course, he still had his moments. The Romans inherited many of the Greek myths, so Jupiter still had his share of extramarital affairs and divine children. But these stories were often downplayed or recontextualized. His relationship with humanity was less personal, more formal. He was the great father, yes, but a stern Roman father, one who demanded respect, duty, and the proper observance of oaths. He was the steady, powerful center of the Roman cosmos, the god who represented the belief that the universe, like the Roman state itself, was governed by a set of sacred, unbreakable laws. Moral of the story: power is best wielded with a sense of dignity and purpose. A good legal system is more effective than a bad temper. And if you're going to be the king of the gods, it helps to have the most powerful empire in the world as your primary client. If Jupiter was the stern and powerful CEO, then his wife and sister, Juno, was the equally formidable and deeply respected chairperson of the board, with a special focus on protecting the company's core values. Let's talk about Juno, the queen of the gods, the goddess of marriage and childbirth, and the divine equivalent of a powerful Roman matron who was also the fierce and unforgiving guardian of the Roman state. Basically, if you've ever felt that you are the embodiment of traditional family values, that your primary duty is to protect the integrity of your household, and that you will unleash the full force of your divine wrath upon anyone who threatens it, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with Rome's most powerful and fiercely protective goddess. Juno was, of course, the Roman Hera, and she inherited all of Hera's famous jealousy and vengeful nature. She was the perpetual rival of her husband's many mistresses and their offspring. But in Rome, her character took on a new and profound dimension. She wasn't just the scorned wife. She was a major state deity, a protector of the Roman people. Her temple on the Capitoline Hill stood beside those of Jupiter and Minerva as part of the great Capitoline Triad. She was Juno Regina, Queen Juno, and her role as a guardian of the state was just as important as her role as a guardian of marriage. She was particularly the protector of women. She was Juno Lucina, who helped women in childbirth, and Juno Moneta, the warner, in whose temple the Roman mint was located, giving us the words money and monetary. She was woven into the very fabric of Roman life, from the birth of a child to the financial security of the state. Her most famous role in Roman mythology is as the primary antagonist in the Aeneid. Her hatred of the Trojans was deep and multi-layered. First, there was the old grudge from the judgment of Paris, where the Trojan prince Paris had chosen Venus over her in a divine beauty contest. Second, she loved the city of Carthage, a great rival to Rome, and she knew that the descendants of the Trojans were fated to destroy it. Her opposition to Aeneas wasn't just personal pique, it was a matter of divine foreign policy. She was trying to protect her favored city from its prophesied doom. Her rage is the engine that drives the entire epic. She unleashes the storm that shipwrecks Aeneas in Carthage. She fans the flames of love between Aeneas and Dido to try and keep him there. And when he finally reaches Italy, she unleashes the fury electo to stir up a brutal and bloody war. She is relentless, powerful, and utterly terrifying in her opposition. She is the embodiment of a divine force that will stop at nothing to protect its own interests. In the end, she is forced to relent by Jupiter and by fate, but she extracts a final concession. The Trojans must not impose their name or their language on the people of Italy. They must become Latins. In this way, even in her defeat, she shapes the final character of the Roman people. She was the great, fierce mother of Rome, whose anger was as formidable as her protection. Let's talk about Neptune, the Roman god of the sea, and the divine equivalent of a powerful, dignified, and occasionally very stormy admiral of the Roman fleet. If Jupiter was the head of state and Juno was the guardian of tradition, Neptune was the master of a vast and crucial part of the empire's infrastructure, the Mediterranean Sea, or as the Romans called it, Mare Nostrum, our sea. Basically, if you've ever felt that you are in charge of a vast and unruly domain, that your primary job is to maintain order and safe passage, but that you are fully capable of unleashing a catastrophic tempest if someone disrupts the peace, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with Rome's most powerful and majestic maritime deity. Neptune was the Roman version of the Greek god Poseidon, and he inherited his brother's dominion over the oceans, earthquakes, and horses. But, in typical Roman fashion, his character was somewhat more restrained, more majestic. While Poseidon was often depicted as a wild, unpredictable, and easily offended force of nature, Neptune was portrayed as a more regal and authoritative ruler of the deep. He was less of a wild sea god and more of a king, his power less chaotic and more controlled. His primary symbol was still the trident, the three-pronged spear with which he could command the waves and shake the earth. He ruled from his golden palace beneath the sea, surrounded by a court of sea nymphs and other marine creatures. For the Romans, a people who were initially quite wary of the sea, Neptune was a god to be respected and appeased. As Rome's power expanded and it became a great naval empire, controlling the trade routes of the Mediterranean, his importance grew. A calm sea, a safe voyage for their grain ships and their legions, was a sign of Neptune's favor. A storm was a sign of his displeasure. His most famous appearance in Roman literature is a brief but highly characteristic one in the Aeneid. After the goddess Juno, in her rage, has the wind god Aeolus unleash a terrible storm upon Aeneas's fleet, Neptune is disturbed. The unauthorized chaos in his domain has roused him from his watery kingdom. He rises from the waves, his presence calm and majestic, and he is not angry at the Trojans. He is angry at the winds for acting without his permission. He rebukes them with the stern authority of a true king. Does your race dare to embroil sky and earth without my divine assent? He thunders. He then calms the storm with a single gesture, his authority over the sea absolute. It's a perfect encapsulation of the Roman Neptune, less interested in the petty squabbles of the other gods, and more concerned with maintaining order and control over his own domain. He was the powerful, dignified, and occasionally terrifying god who ensured that the waters of our sea remained firmly under Roman control. Now, let's talk about Mars, the Roman god of war, and the divine equivalent of a highly respected founding father of the nation, who also happens to be its most decorated and terrifying 5-star general. This is one of the most significant and telling rebrands in the entire divine corporate merger between Greece and Rome. Basically, if you've ever felt that you embody both the brutal, destructive chaos of the battlefield and the disciplined, honorable strength that secures the state, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with Rome's most important and revered military deity. In Greece, his counterpart was Ares, and to be blunt, nobody really liked Ares. He was the god of bloodlust, of the savage, chaotic, and dishonorable aspects of fighting. He was often depicted as a coward and a bully, frequently defeated and humiliated by other gods and even mortals. He had very few temples and was generally seen as a necessary but unpleasant part of the cosmic order. Mars, on the other hand, was one of the most important and beloved gods in the Roman pantheon. He wasn't just the god of war. He was the god of Roman military might, of the disciplined, strategic, and ultimately victorious nature of the Roman legions. War, for the Romans, was not a chaotic affair. It was the primary instrument of state policy, the engine of their empire, and Mars was its divine patron. He was second only to Jupiter in importance. His sacred animals were the wolf and the woodpecker, and his main temple was located not within the city's sacred boundary, but outside it, on the Campus Martius, the field of Mars, where the Roman army trained. This was symbolic. The power of war was to be kept outside the civil life of the city until it was needed. But his importance went even deeper. He was not just a protector, he was a progenitor. Mars was the divine father of Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome. He had coupled with the Vestal virgin Rhea Silvia, and from their union, the founders of the world's greatest empire were born. This made him the literal ancestor of the Roman people. They were the sons of Mars, and their destiny to conquer and to rule was a part of their divine inheritance. This is a profound difference. While the Greeks saw their god of war as a problematic outsider, the Romans saw theirs as a revered father figure. He was both Mars Gradivus, the marcher, who led their armies into battle, and Mars Pater, Father Mars, the guardian of their people and their agriculture. He represented the Roman ideal, that the same disciplined strength that won wars was also necessary to protect the peace and ensure the prosperity of the farm. He was the ultimate soldier-citizen, the divine embodiment of the power and the glory of Rome. Let's talk about Venus, the Roman goddess of love, beauty, desire, and the divine matriarch of the entire Roman people. If Mars was the revered founding father, Venus was the glamorous and politically savvy founding mother, the celestial ancestor whose divine lineage gave the Romans, especially the powerful Julian clan, their ultimate claim to legitimacy. Basically, if you've ever felt that you are the embodiment of irresistible charm and that your primary job is to ensure the success and divine destiny of your favorite descendants, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with Rome's most beautiful and fiercely maternal deity. Venus was, of course, the Roman Aphrodite, and she inherited all of her Greek counterparts' domains: love, beauty, sex, fertility, and desire. She was the goddess of gardens and vineyards, a symbol of the creative, life-giving forces of nature. She was a goddess of charm and seduction, a power that could move both mortals and gods. But for the Romans, her most important role was as a progenitor. She was Venus Genetrix, Mother Venus. Her son was the Trojan hero Aeneas, who had escaped the fall of Troy, and after a long and arduous journey, had come to Italy to become the ancestor of the Roman people. This made Venus the divine grandmother of Rome. This was not a minor detail. It was a cornerstone of Roman identity and political propaganda. Julius Caesar and his adopted son, the future Emperor Augustus, claimed direct descent from Venus through her grandson, Iulus, also known as Ascanius, the son of Aeneas. They built a magnificent temple to Venus Genetrix in the heart of Rome, a very public and very powerful statement that their family, and by extension their rule, was divinely ordained. In the Aeneid, Venus is a major character, the ultimate celestial helicopter mom. She is the divine protector of her son Aeneas. While the furious Juno does everything in her power to destroy him, Venus does everything in hers to save him. She guides him with signs. She heals his wounds. She appears to him in disguise to give him advice, and she pleads his case before the other gods. She even convinces her long-suffering husband, Vulcan, the god of the forge, to craft a magnificent set of divine armor for her son, including a shield that depicts the entire future history of Rome. Her love for Aeneas is a powerful, driving force in the epic, a symbol of the divine favor that watched over Rome's origins. She was a far more complex and politically significant figure than the often frivolous Aphrodite. She was a goddess of love, yes, but it was a love that was tied to destiny, to family, and to the grand historical project of the Roman Empire. She was the beautiful, powerful, and fiercely protective mother of a people destined to rule the world. Let's talk about Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom, strategic warfare, and all the arts and crafts. If Jupiter was the CEO and Juno was the chair of the board, Minerva was the brilliant and highly respected head of the company's entire strategic division, from engineering and product design to military planning and corporate branding. Basically, if you've ever felt that you are the smartest person in the room, that victory is achieved through superior strategy, not brute force, and that you have a particular talent for both weaving and tactical planning, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with Rome's most intelligent and formidable goddess. Minerva was the Roman equivalent of the Greek goddess Athena, and she shared all of her core domains. She, too, was said to have sprung fully formed and fully armed from the head of her father, Jupiter, making her a goddess of pure intellect and divine wisdom. She was the patroness of craftsmen, of artisans, of teachers, of doctors, and of inventors. Any skilled or intellectual pursuit was under her protection. She was the divine spark of human ingenuity. But it was her role as a goddess of war that, like Mars, highlights a key aspect of the Roman character. While Mars represented the raw, martial power of the legions, the fury of the battle itself, Minerva represented the strategic and intellectual side of warfare. She was the goddess of the plan, of the well-thought-out campaign, of the clever tactic that outwits the enemy. The Romans, who were master strategists and engineers, revered this aspect of warfare. They understood that battles were won not just with swords, but with well-built siege engines, disciplined formations, and a superior battle plan. Minerva was the divine patron of the Roman military genius. She was a member of the great Capitoline Triad, alongside Jupiter and Juno. Her temple stood on the Capitoline Hill, at the very heart of Rome's religious and political life. This shows her immense importance to the state. She was not just a goddess of personal wisdom. She was a guardian of the wisdom of the Roman state, the divine mind that guided its decisions and its destiny. Unlike the often meddling Athena of Greek myth, Minerva was a more distant and dignified figure. She was a virgin goddess who remained aloof from the romantic squabbles of the other deities. Her focus was on her domains, on knowledge, on strategy, and on the skilled application of that knowledge to create and to defend. She was the cool, calculating, and brilliant mind of the Roman pantheon, the goddess who embodied the belief that the greatest power of all was the power of a well-ordered and disciplined intellect. She was the divine embodiment of the very qualities that made Rome the master of the world. Let's descend to the Roman underworld, a realm ruled by a silent and often overlooked king. Let's talk about Pluto, the god of the dead, and the divine equivalent of the incredibly wealthy but reclusive owner of the company's vast and largely unseen subterranean assets. Basically, if you've ever felt that you are in charge of an immense and inescapable domain, that your name is so feared people avoid saying it, and that you are, quite literally, sitting on a gold mine, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with Rome's richest and most antisocial deity. Pluto was the Roman version of the Greek god Hades, and his name itself is a clue to his character. It comes from the Greek Pluton, which means the wealthy one. The Romans, being a practical people, focused less on the gloom and doom of the underworld and more on the fact that their god of the dead was also the god of all the mineral wealth that lay hidden beneath the earth, the gold, the silver, the precious gems. He was the richest of all the gods, but his wealth was unseen and largely inaccessible. He was a silent partner in the cosmic corporation, his value immense, but his public profile almost non-existent. Like Hades, Pluto was not an evil god. He was just stern, inexorable, and very, very serious about his job. He was the ruler of the underworld, which the Romans called Orcus, or Dispater, the rich father. His primary role was to ensure that the dead stayed in their place and that the laws of his kingdom were respected. He rarely, if ever, left his subterranean realm. He had no major temples in the city of Rome itself. His worship was conducted at special designated sites, often involving trenches dug into the earth. He was a god to be respected from a distance. The Roman underworld itself was largely inherited from the Greeks, with a few local additions. There was the river Styx, the ferryman Charon, and the three-headed dog Cerberus. The souls of the dead, the manes, were judged and sent to their appropriate place. For the wicked, there was Tartarus. For the heroes, there was the Elysian fields. And for the average soul, there was the dreary, shadowy plains of Asphodel. Pluto's most famous story is, of course, the abduction of his queen, Proserpina, the Roman version of Persephone. The story is almost identical to the Greek myth. The abduction, the grief of her mother Ceres, Demeter, the resulting famine, and the final compromise that created the seasons. Pluto, like Hades, is portrayed as a lonely king who takes a bride by force, a stern and powerful ruler who is nonetheless capable of being moved, albeit through a complex divine negotiation. He was the great, silent king of a silent kingdom, a god whose power was as vast as the earth itself, but whose presence was as quiet as the grave. He was the inevitable end, the final accountant, the rich father who would one day welcome all of his mortal children into his dark, quiet, and inescapable home. Let's talk about the divine twins, the beautiful and powerful children of Jupiter, who represented two sides of a single, radiant coin. Let's talk about Apollo and Diana, the god of prophecy and order, and the goddess of the hunt and the wild. They were the celestial equivalent of the company's brilliant in-house legal counsel and its fierce, independent head of wilderness operations. Basically, if you and your twin have ever felt that you perfectly balance each other, with you handling the arts, the law, and the rational order of the day, while your sibling handles the untamed, instinctive, and moonlit world of the night, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with Rome's most famous and complementary divine siblings. Apollo was, for the most part, imported directly from Greece with very few changes. The Romans were so impressed with the Greek god Apollo that they didn't even bother to change his name. He was the god of music, of poetry, of archery, of medicine, and most importantly, of prophecy. He was a god of light and reason, the embodiment of the classical ideal of order and harmony. His most famous oracle was at Delphi in Greece, a place that even the Romans held in high esteem. In Rome, he was seen as a god of healing and a protector against plagues. But his most important role, especially during the reign of the Emperor Augustus, was as a symbol of moral order and disciplined art. Augustus made Apollo his personal patron deity, a symbol of the peace and cultural golden age he was trying to establish. Diana was the Roman Artemis, the twin sister of Apollo. She was the goddess of the hunt, of the wilderness, of the moon, and of chastity. She was a fierce and independent goddess who roamed the forests with her band of nymphs, a protector of wild animals, and a powerful, untamed force. She was the embodiment of the natural world, in all its beauty and its danger. In Rome, she also took on the role of a protector of women, especially in childbirth, and was seen as a guardian of the lower classes and of slaves. Her temple on the Aventine Hill in Rome was a sanctuary for the common people. Together, the twins represented a fundamental duality. Apollo was the god of the sun, though this role was often shared with Sol, of the clear light of day, of the well-ordered city, of the rational mind, and of the structured art of poetry and music. Diana was the goddess of the moon, of the mysterious light of the night, of the untamed wilderness beyond the city walls, of the instinctive body, and of the wild freedom of nature. They were the perfect balance of the civilized and the wild, of the rational and the instinctive. They were two powerful, independent deities who, together, represented a complete and harmonious vision of the cosmos. Let's talk about the divine workforce, the two gods who were always on the move, always on a mission, the indispensable employees who handled the company's manufacturing and communications. Let's talk about Vulcan and Mercury, the god of the forge and the god of the message. They were the celestial equivalent of the brilliant, hard-working chief engineer and the fast-talking, deal-making head of logistics and delivery services. Basically, if you've ever felt that you are the underappreciated genius who builds all the cool stuff, while your colleague is the smooth-talking messenger who gets all the credit for delivering it, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the two hardest-working gods in the Roman pantheon. Vulcan was the Roman Hephaestus, the god of fire, of volcanoes, and of all metalworking and craftsmanship. He was the master artisan of the gods. His forge was located deep beneath a volcano, usually Mount Etna, in Sicily. It was there, with the help of the Cyclopes as his assistants, that he crafted the magnificent objects of the gods, Jupiter's lightning bolts, the armor of the heroes, the magnificent thrones of the Olympians. He was a god of immense creative power, the divine engine of all manufacturing. But he was also lame, having been cast out of heaven by his mother Juno because of his deformity. He was the brilliant, hard-working outcast, the god whose beauty was in the things he made, not in his own form. He was married to the most beautiful of the goddesses, Venus, a notoriously mismatched pairing that was the source of much divine drama. He was a powerful and essential god, but he was also a figure of some pathos, the hard-working laborer whose genius was often overshadowed by the flashy beauty of the other gods. Mercury, on the other hand, was all about flash and speed. He was the Roman Hermes, the messenger of the gods. With his winged sandals and his winged cap, he was the embodiment of swiftness and communication. He was the god who traveled between the worlds, carrying messages from Jupiter to mortals, guiding the souls of the dead to the underworld, and generally acting as the divine go-between. He was the patron god of travelers, of merchants, and also of thieves, a nod to his trickster nature. He was a god of boundaries, of the space between things, and of the cleverness needed to navigate that space successfully. He was the ultimate celestial networker, the smooth-talking god who could get you a message, a deal, or a safe passage. Together, these two gods represented the backbone of the divine economy. Vulcan was production, the one who made the tangible goods of the cosmos. Mercury was distribution, the one who managed the flow of information and commerce. One was a grimy, powerful creator, the other a slick, eloquent communicator. They were the essential and often overlooked gods who made sure that the grand, celestial empire actually functioned on a day-to-day basis. Now, let's turn to a uniquely Roman concept, a goddess so central to the Roman identity that her worship was a matter of national survival. Let's talk about Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, the home, and the sacred fire of the Roman state. If the pantheon was a cosmic corporation, Vesta was not an executive. She was the company's very soul, its core culture, the eternal flame that kept the entire enterprise from collapsing into darkness. Basically, if you've ever felt that you are the quiet, steady, and absolutely essential center of your family and community, and that your primary role is to maintain a tradition that is the source of all warmth and life, congratulations. you've spiritually connected with Rome's most sacred and steadfast goddess. Vesta was the Roman equivalent of the Greek goddess Hestia, but her importance in Rome was magnified to an incredible degree. She was the goddess of the literal hearth fire, the focus, which was the center of every Roman home. The family would gather around it for warmth, for food, and for religious rites. Vesta was the divine presence that made a house a home. But her role extended far beyond the private family. She was also the goddess of the public hearth of Rome itself. In the very heart of the Roman Forum stood the Temple of Vesta. It was not a grand, rectangular temple like those of the other gods. It was a small, round building, shaped like a traditional Roman hut, symbolizing the home of the entire Roman people. And inside this temple, there was no statue of the goddess. Her presence was embodied in the one thing the temple contained: an eternal, sacred flame. This flame was the symbol of the eternal life and power of Rome. It was believed that as long as the flame burned, Rome would be safe and would prosper. If the flame ever went out, it was a sign of a terrible disaster, a sign that the gods had abandoned the city. The tending of this sacred flame was one of the most important religious duties in all of Rome, and it was entrusted to a unique and highly honored group of priestesses, the Vestal Virgins. These were 6 women, chosen in childhood from noble families, who dedicated 30 years of their lives to the service of the goddess. They took a vow of chastity, a symbol of their absolute devotion to the state. Their duty was to ensure that the sacred flame never went out, day or night. It was a task of immense responsibility. If a Vestal let the flame go out, she was severely punished. If she broke her vow of chastity, a crime seen as a form of treason that polluted the state, she was sentenced to a terrible death, to be buried alive. But the Vestals were also immensely powerful and respected. They were the only full-time female priests in Rome, and they enjoyed a level of independence and privilege that no other Roman woman had. Vesta was a quiet, unassuming goddess. She had no dramatic myths, no love affairs, no great battles. She simply was. She was the still, silent, and absolutely essential center of Roman life. The goddess who represented the belief that the strength of an empire was built not on its armies or its wealth, but on the sacred, enduring flame of its home. The great city of Troy was a sea of fire and screams. The night, which should have been silent and peaceful after 10 long years of siege, had been shattered by the treachery of the great wooden horse. The Achaeans, who had pretended to sail away in defeat, had returned like a tide of death, pouring from the belly of their wooden gift and opening the gates to their hidden army. Now, the city was dying. Its magnificent towers, which had stood for generations, were collapsing into dust and flame. The air was thick with the smoke of burning cedar and the coppery scent of blood. The sounds of battle echoed through the once proud streets. The clash of bronze on bronze, the triumphant shouts of the Greeks, and the despairing cries of the Trojans, woken from their beds to find their world ending. In the midst of this chaos, Aeneas, a prince of Troy, a warrior second only to the great Hector, was torn from a deep sleep by a vision. The ghost of Hector himself, bloody and mangled as he had been when he was dragged behind Achilles' chariot, appeared before him. The ghost did not speak of fighting back, of a glorious last stand. He spoke of escape, of destiny. "Flee, goddess born," the shade whispered. its voice the rustle of dry leaves. The enemy holds the walls. Troy is falling from its high peak. You have given enough to your country. If this citadel could be defended by any right hand, it would have been defended by mine. Troy entrusts to you her sacred things and her household gods. Take them as companions of your fate. Seek for them a great city, which you will establish at last after you have wandered over the sea. Aeneas awoke to the full horror of the night. He climbed to the roof of his father's house and saw the truth of Hector's words. The city was lost. A mad, desperate desire for a heroic death seized him. He gathered a few of his fellow warriors, and they plunged into the hopeless fight, a small band of doomed men seeking only a glorious end. But the gods and his destiny would not allow it. He was guided by his mother, the goddess Venus, who appeared to him in a blaze of divine light. She showed him a vision that no mortal was meant to see. She parted the mists of the mortal world, and he saw the gods themselves tearing his city apart. He saw Neptune, with his great trident, toppling the walls. He saw the fierce Juno, armed with a spear, guarding the Scaean gate. He even saw the great Jupiter, urging the Greeks on. His fight was not with mortals, but with the gods themselves. It is not the hated face of the Spartan woman, Helen, nor the blame of Paris, Venus told him. It is the harsh will of the gods that is overthrowing this kingdom. She urged him to flee, to save his family, to think not of a glorious death, but of the great future that was his fated duty. His heart filled with a new, heavier purpose, he turned away from the battle, away from the death of his city, and towards the small, fragile flame of his family's survival. Aeneas ran through the burning, chaotic streets, his mind now fixed on a single purpose: escape. He reached the house of his father, Anchises, a place that had once been a sanctuary of peace and was now just another island in a sea of destruction. He found his family huddled together, his old, frail father, Anchises, his young son, Aeneas, also called Iulus, and his beloved wife, Creusa. He told them they had to flee, but Anchises, old and proud, refused. He would not leave the city of his ancestors. He would not drag out a life of exile. He urged the others to go, but he was resolved to die there, in his home, with his city. It was a moment of profound, tragic despair. Aeneas, his heart breaking, refused to leave his father. If they were to die, they would die together. He took up his arms again, ready to rush back into the hopeless fight and meet his end. But at that moment, a divine omen appeared. A gentle, harmless flame, a soft corona of light, began to play around the head of his young son, Aeneas. It was a sign from the gods. Anchises, who knew how to read the portents, was stunned. He raised his hands to the heavens and prayed to Jupiter for a confirmation. Immediately, a clap of thunder echoed on the left, a favorable sign, and a shooting star streaked across the sky, its fiery trail pointing the way out of the city, towards the mountains. Anchises hesitated no longer. The will of the gods was clear. He agreed to go. The plan was set. Aeneas would carry his father, who was too weak to walk the treacherous streets. "Come then, dear father," Aeneas said. "Clasp my neck. I will carry you on my shoulders. Our danger will be one, and one our salvation." He lifted the old man, who clutched the sacred household gods, the penates, in his hands. He then took his son, Aeneas, by the hand, the boy's small steps, struggling to keep up with his father's long strides. And he told his wife, Creusa, to follow behind them at a distance, to avoid drawing attention. he instructed their servants to take different paths and to all meet at a designated spot outside the city walls, an ancient cypress tree by a deserted shrine of the goddess Ceres. And so, the small, desperate family began their flight. Aeneas, who had once strode through Troy as a fearless warrior, was now burdened with the past and the future, carrying his father on his back and leading his son by the hand. Every shadow made him jump. Every sound made him fear, not for himself, but for the precious lives that depended on him. They moved like ghosts through the dying city, a tiny, fragile procession of refugees, the last remnants of Troy, carrying the heavy weight of its memory and the even heavier burden of its fated future. They reached the meeting place, the ancient cypress tree outside the city walls. The servants and other refugees were there, a small, sorrowful crowd of survivors. But one person was missing. Creusa was gone. A cold, terrible dread seized Aeneas. He had lost her somewhere in the chaos of the flight. He let out a cry of pure anguish. He had saved his father and his son, but he had lost his wife. He left his father and son in the care of the others, and, in a mad frenzy of grief and guilt, he strapped on his armor and ran back into the city, back into the heart of the inferno, to find her. He retraced their steps, his eyes scanning the burning ruins, his voice calling her name again and again. He went back to their house, now a smoldering ruin, filled with Greek soldiers looting their possessions. He went to the citadel, to the temple of Juno, but she was not there. The city was a ghost town, its life extinguished, its streets filled only with the victorious enemy and the dead. He wandered through the desolation, his shouts of Creusa echoing unanswered in the smoky air. Finally, as he continued his desperate, hopeless search, a phantom appeared before him. It was a shade, a sorrowful and ethereal image, and it was larger than the woman he had known. It was the ghost of Creusa. Aeneas froze, his hair standing on end, his voice caught in his throat. He tried to speak, but he could not. The ghost of his wife spoke to him, her voice calm and filled with a sad, otherworldly wisdom. She told him not to grieve. She explained that what had happened was the will of the gods. She was not fated to leave Troy with him. She was now in the care of the great mother goddess, Cybele. She then spoke to him of his own destiny, the prophecy he had heard from Hector. "A long exile is your fate," she said, "and a vast expanse of sea you must sail. You will come to the land of Hesperia, where the Lydian Tiber flows with its gentle course through the rich fields of men. There, joyful things, a kingdom, and a royal wife are ordained for you." She was releasing him, comforting him, turning his mind from his personal grief to his great historical duty. She told him not to weep for her, but to cherish the son they shared. Aeneas, his eyes filled with tears, tried to embrace her. 3 times he reached out to put his arms around her neck, and 3 times the phantom slipped through his grasp, as insubstantial as the wind, as fleeting as a dream. She faded away into the darkness, leaving him alone in the ruins of his city, with a heart heavy with a sorrow that would never leave him. He turned for the last time away from Troy. He accepted the finality of his loss and the weight of his destiny. He returned to his father and son, and with the other survivors, he made his way to the mountains to begin the long, weary journey to a new home he had never seen. With a small fleet of 20 ships built in secret in the shadow of Mount Ida, Aeneas and the Trojan survivors, a nation of refugees, set sail upon the vast, unknown sea. They were leaving behind the ashes of their home, the graves of their families, and the entire world they had ever known. Before them lay only the words of a prophecy and the cold, salt spray of the open water. For years they wandered, seeking the promised land of Hesperia. They were like ghosts on the water, driven by a destiny they did not fully understand. They made landfall in Thrace, only to be met by a horrifying omen. They tried to settle in Crete, believing it to be their ancestral home, but a terrible plague drove them back to their ships. They were chased from their course by the Harpies, monstrous bird women who defiled their food. They sailed past Ithaca, the home of their hated enemy, Odysseus. They were a people without a country, their journey a long, sorrowful epic of false starts and dashed hopes. Finally, after many trials, they reached the western coast of Greece. Here, at Buthrotum, they found a small, new Troy, ruled by Helenus, a son of King Priam, and Andromache, the widow of the great Hector. It was a bittersweet reunion, a meeting of ghosts in a land of exile. Helenus, who was a prophet, gave Aeneas new, more specific instructions for his journey. He warned him of the dangers of Scylla and Charybdis, and told him he must sail the long way around Sicily. And he gave him a crucial piece of advice. When he reached Italy, he must seek out the Sibyl of Cumae, the great prophetess who would guide him. And so they sailed on, their spirits renewed with a clearer sense of their path. They rounded Sicily, and it was there that another great sorrow fell upon them. At Drepanum, his aged father, Anchises, the wise old man who had been his moral compass and his living link to the past, finally died. Aeneas was devastated. He had carried his father from the flames of Troy, and now he had to bury him in a foreign land. His grief was profound. He had lost his city, his wife, and now his father. He was truly alone, the leader of a weary and broken people. It was from here, as they set sail from Sicily, their hearts heavy with this new grief, that the final and most terrible storm was unleashed. The goddess Juno, her ancient hatred for the Trojans still burning with a white-hot fury, saw them nearing their destination. She could not bear the thought of them succeeding. She went to Aeolus, the king of the winds, and, with the promise of a beautiful nymph for a bride, she bribed him to release his caged winds and destroy the Trojan fleet. Aeolus, tempted, agreed. He struck the side of his mountain prison with his spear, and the winds, which had been chained in the earth, burst forth in a single cataclysmic hurricane. The sky was instantly plunged into darkness. The sea rose in mountainous waves. The Trojan ships were scattered, their oars shattered, their sails torn. It was a storm of pure, divine rage, a tempest designed not just to delay, but to annihilate. Aeneas's own ship was battered, and he watched in horror as other ships in his fleet were swallowed by the waves, their crews lost to the churning, black water. He felt his own courage fail him. He cried out to the heavens, wishing he had died a glorious death back at Troy, rather than this ignominious end in a nameless sea. He was at the mercy of a cruel and vengeful God, his great destiny on the verge of being extinguished forever. The storm, unleashed by Juno's fury, had shattered the Trojan fleet and scattered its survivors across the sea. Aeneas, his own ship battered but still afloat, managed to guide it and 6 other vessels into a sheltered cove on the coast of a strange and unknown land. It was Libya, the coast of North Africa. The men, exhausted and demoralized, stumbled ashore. They were alive, but they were broken. They had lost many of their comrades, and they did not know where they were. Aeneas, though his own heart was heavy with grief and despair, knew he had to be their leader. He hid his own sorrow and put on a face of hope. He climbed a high cliff to survey the land, but saw no sign of his other ships. He did, however, see a herd of deer. He took his bow and shot 7 of them, one for each of his surviving ships. He then gathered his men and gave them a speech of encouragement, his words a powerful balm for their weary souls. He reminded them of the other dangers they had faced, of Scylla and Charybdis, of the land of the Cyclops. "We have suffered worse than this before," he told them. "This too, one day, it will be a pleasure to remember. Endure and save yourselves for happier times." They made a fire, cooked the venison, and for a moment they forgot their suffering in the simple, restorative act of a shared meal. The next day, Aeneas, accompanied by his faithful friend Achates, set out to explore this new land. As they walked through the woods, a figure appeared before them. It was a beautiful huntress, armed with a bow and quiver. But it was no mortal woman. It was his mother, the goddess Venus, in disguise. She told them they were in the kingdom of Carthage, a new city being built by refugees from Tyre, led by their queen, the brilliant and beautiful Dido. She told them the story of Dido, of how her wicked brother had murdered her husband for his gold, and how she had led her people in a daring escape to found a new home in this land. Venus then shrouded her son and his friend in a magical mist, making them invisible, so they could walk safely into the heart of the city and see it for themselves. Aeneas was stunned by what he saw. Carthage was a bustling, vibrant city, rising from the earth with incredible speed and energy. The people were building a great citadel, a harbor, a theater. It was a vision of civilization being born, a testament to the courage and resilience of its people. At the center of the city, they saw a magnificent temple being built, dedicated to the goddess Juno. And on the walls of this temple, Aeneas saw something that made him stop in his tracks, his heart filled with a mixture of sorrow and wonder. The walls were decorated with a series of magnificent murals depicting the battles of the Trojan War. He saw the Greek armies. He saw Achilles in his rage. He saw the death of his friends. He saw his own people's suffering and their heroism, all immortalized in art in this strange, distant land. Tears streamed down his face. "Even here," he whispered to Achates, "our fame has reached. Even here, there are tears for things, and mortal matters touch the heart." In that moment, surrounded by the images of his dead past, he felt a flicker of hope for his future. As Aeneas stood weeping before the images of his fallen city, the great Queen Dido herself arrived at the temple to conduct her daily business. She was a figure of regal beauty and authority, surrounded by her loyal followers. She sat on her high throne in the temple sanctuary and began to dispense justice and assign tasks to her people, a wise and beloved ruler. At that moment, a group of men entered the temple, seeking an audience with the queen. Aeneas, still shrouded in his mist of invisibility, was stunned to see that they were his own men, the captains of the ships he had thought lost in the storm. They had also washed ashore and had come to the city to plead for the queen's mercy. Their leader, Aeneas, spoke with great dignity. He told the queen who they were, Trojans, survivors of the Great War, and how they had been shipwrecked on her shores by a terrible storm. He assured her They had not come as conquerors or pirates, but as humble suppliants, seeking only to repair their ships so they could continue their fated journey to Italy. Dido listened with a profound and generous sympathy. She had known exile and suffering herself, and her heart was moved by their plight. She immediately offered them her complete protection. She told them they were welcome in her city, that she would help them repair their ships, and that if they wished to stay and share in her new kingdom, they would be treated not as strangers, but as equals. "The city I am building is yours," she declared. At that moment, as she spoke these words of incredible generosity, the mist around Aeneas and Achates dissolved, and they stood revealed in the full light of the temple. Aeneas, his appearance enhanced by his goddess mother, shone with a divine beauty. He stepped forward and gave his thanks to the queen, praising her compassion and her justice. Dido was spellbound. She was struck by his noble bearing, by the story of his great suffering, and by his sheer heroic presence. She had been a widow, her heart closed to love since the murder of her husband. But now, she felt a strange, new warmth. Venus, seeing this, decided to ensure that Dido's sympathy would turn into a deep and binding love to guarantee her son's safety. She sent her other son, Cupid, the god of love, disguised as Aeneas's own son, Aeneas. That evening, Dido held a magnificent banquet in her palace in honor of her Trojan guests. The hall was a wonder of purple tapestries and golden plates. As the feast progressed, Dido, her heart already stirred, took the young boy she believed to be Aeneas onto her lap. The disguised god of love breathed a subtle fire into her, a divine poison of passion, erasing the memory of her dead husband and filling her with a new, all-consuming love for Aeneas. Her fate was sealed. As the banquet continued, she turned to Aeneas, and her eyes shining with this new magical love, she asked him to tell his own story from the beginning, to recount the final, terrible night of Troy and the long 7 years of his wandering. And Aeneas, his voice heavy with the weight of memory, began the tale that would bind her heart to his forever. The days that followed the great banquet in Carthage were a time of enchantment and deepening passion. Dido, her heart now completely captivated by the divine fire of Cupid, was consumed by her love for the Trojan hero. She was a woman in the grip of a force she could not control. She would wander through the city as if in a daze, the great construction projects she had once overseen now forgotten. The towers stood half-finished. The harbor works were silent. Her entire being was focused on Aeneas. She would hang on his every word as he recounted his adventures, and when he was gone, she would see his face in her mind and hear his voice in the silence of her chambers. The love was a wound, a sweet and terrible sickness in her soul. She confided in her sister, Anna, who encouraged the match. A marriage between the Trojans and the Carthaginians would create a powerful new kingdom, she argued. And for Dido herself, who had been alone for so long, it was a chance for happiness. Encouraged by her sister's words, Dido let go of her vows to her dead husband and gave herself over to her passion. Aeneas, for his part, was also captivated. After years of wandering and suffering, the comfort and luxury of Dido's court and the love of a beautiful and powerful queen were a powerful balm. He, too, began to forget his fated mission. He stayed in Carthage through the winter, enjoying the life of a prince consort, even helping to oversee the building of the city he now considered a second home. The two lovers were inseparable. They would spend their days in conversation, in feasts, and in shared dreams of a future together. The climax of their love affair came during a royal hunt. The court rode out in a magnificent procession of purple and gold. But during the hunt, the goddess Juno, who saw this love affair as the perfect way to stop Aeneas from reaching Italy, conjured a great storm. The sky grew dark, and a torrential rain began to fall. The hunting party was scattered. Aeneas and Dido, seeking shelter, found themselves alone in the same small cave. In the darkness of the cave, with the storm raging outside, they consummated their love. For Dido, this was a marriage. The heavens themselves seemed to bless their union with the storm's thunder and lightning. She no longer tried to hide her love. She considered it a sacred, binding commitment. But for Aeneas, and for the gods who watched from above, it was a dangerous diversion. It was a beautiful, passionate interlude, but it was not his destiny. The hero who was fated to found the world's greatest empire was now lingering in a foreign city, his great purpose forgotten, lost in the arms of a woman whose love was powerful enough to rival the will of the gods themselves. The news of the love affair between Dido and Aeneas did not stay secret for long. It was carried on the winds by rumor, a monstrous goddess with as many eyes and tongues as she had feathers, who flew through the cities of men, spreading a mixture of truth and lies. The news reached the ears of Iarbas, a neighboring African king, a son of Jupiter, whom Dido had previously spurned. He was filled with a jealous rage and prayed to his father, Jupiter, complaining bitterly that this Trojan refugee had stolen the queen who had refused him. Jupiter heard his son's prayer. He looked down from Olympus and saw Aeneas in Carthage, no longer a weary warrior, but a comfortable prince wearing a cloak of Tyrian purple embroidered with gold, a gift from Dido. He was helping to build a city that was not his own, his great destiny forgotten. The king of the gods knew that this could not continue. The fate of Rome, which was to bring law and order to the entire world, was being jeopardized by this dalliance. The historical clock was ticking, and Aeneas was running late. Jupiter turned to his son, Mercury, the messenger god, and gave him a stern command. He was to fly down to Carthage and remind Aeneas of his duty. "Go now," Jupiter commanded. "Speak to him." He was not the man his goddess mother promised us. He was to be the man who would rule Italy, a land pregnant with empires and fierce in war, the man who would pass on, a race from the high blood of Teucer, and bring the whole world under the rule of law. If the glory of such a great destiny does not fire his heart, does he, a father, grudge the citadel of Rome to his own son Ascanius? What is he doing? With what hope does he waste his time among a hostile people, forgetting his own descendants in the fields of Lavinium? Let him set sail. This is the sum of it. Let this be our message. Mercury immediately strapped on his winged sandals and flew down from the heavens. He found Aeneas just as Jupiter had seen him, standing on the battlements of Carthage, overseeing the construction. The messenger god did not mince words. He delivered Jupiter's message with a cold, divine authority. He reminded Aeneas of his son, of his destiny, of the great empire he was fated to found. "You are forgetting your own kingdom, your own fate," Mercury said, his voice a sharp, divine rebuke. The god's words struck Aeneas like a bolt of lightning. He was terrified. The vision of the god, The direct command from the king of the cosmos shocked him out of his blissful stupor. He was on fire to be gone, to obey the divine will. But as he looked out at the city he had helped to build, his heart was filled with a terrible dread. He knew he had to leave, but he did not know how he could possibly tell the queen. Aeneas was torn. The command of the gods was absolute, but his love for Dido was real, and he knew that his departure would destroy her. He secretly called his captains and ordered them to prepare the fleet for a silent, immediate departure. He hoped to find the right moment, the right words, to break the news to the queen gently, but he never got the chance. Dido, her senses sharpened by the terrible anxieties of a lover, felt the change in him. She sensed the deception. The goddess Rumor brought her the news that the fleet was being prepared. She flew into a rage, a storm of grief and betrayal. She was no longer the calm, dignified queen. She was a woman on the verge of madness. She hunted Aeneas down and confronted him in the streets of the palace, her voice filled with a terrible, wounded fury. "Traitor!" she screamed. "Did you really think you could hide such a crime? Could steal away from my land in silence? Does our love not hold you? Does the pledge we gave each other not hold you? Does the thought of Dido dying a cruel death not hold you?" She pleaded with him, reminding him of their love, which she had considered a marriage. She told him that because of him, she had made enemies of the neighboring kings, that her own people were beginning to question her. She begged him, by their union, by the tears she was weeping, to stay. Aeneas stood before her, his heart breaking, but his face a mask of grim, stoic resolve. He was bound by fate, by the command of a god. He tried to explain. He told her he had never intended to deceive her. He argued that he had never formally offered her marriage, that their union, however beautiful, was not a binding contract. And then he delivered the final, cruel blow. He told her that his departure was not his own choice. "It is not of my own free will that I search for Italy," he said, his voice cold with the weight of his divine duty. He spoke of the commands of Jupiter, of the ghost of his father who haunted his dreams, of the future of his son Aeneas, whose kingdom he was stealing. He was a man in the grip of a destiny larger than his own personal happiness. Dido listened, her initial rage turning into a cold, contemptuous despair. She saw that his heart was closed to her, that his piety, his duty, was a force she could not fight. She gave him a final, terrible reply, her voice filled with a chilling prophecy of his future suffering. She told him she would not hold him back, but that she hoped he would find his death on the rocks at sea, and that she, as a ghost, would haunt him forever. With that, she turned from him and fainted into the arms of her maids, who carried her back to her chambers. The conversation was over. The bond was broken. Aeneas stood for a moment, shaken, but his resolve did not waver. He returned to his ships, a man who had chosen his destiny over his love, and in doing so had condemned the woman he loved to a terrible end. The Trojans worked with a frantic energy, preparing their ships to leave the harbor that had been their sanctuary. From the high towers of her palace, Dido watched them. The sight of their preparations, of the sails being unfurled, was a final, physical confirmation of her abandonment. The pain was so intense, it drove her to the edge of madness. She sent her sister, Anna, to Aeneas one last time, not to ask him to stay forever, but to beg for a small delay, for a few more days to allow her to grow accustomed to her grief. But Aeneas, his heart shielded by the commands of the gods, refused to even hear her plea. He was immovable. Dido knew then that all hope was lost. She made her final, terrible decision. She would die. She concealed her true intent from her devoted sister. She told Anna that she had found a magical rite that would either cure her of her love or release her from it forever. She instructed Anna to build a great funeral pyre in the inner courtyard of the palace, and to place upon it all the things that Aeneas had left behind: his clothes, his armor, and the bed on which they had lain together. Anna, suspecting nothing, tearfully obeyed, believing she was helping her sister to perform a final act of magical closure. That night, as the Trojan fleet waited for a favorable wind, Aeneas slept on his ship. The ghost of Mercury appeared to him in a dream once more, its face stern and urgent. The god warned him that Dido was plotting something terrible and that he was in danger. He urged him to leave immediately before the dawn. A woman, the god warned, is always a fickle and changeable thing. Aeneas awoke in a panic and commanded his men to cut the mooring ropes and set sail at once into the darkness. At dawn, Dido awoke and saw from her window that the harbor was empty. The Trojan fleet was gone. A final, convulsive wave of grief and rage washed over her. She beat her breast and tore at her golden hair. She screamed curses after the departing fleet, calling on the gods to witness her betrayal. And then she uttered her great, terrible, and prophetic curse. She prayed that Aeneas would be plagued by war in his new land, that he would be separated from his son, and that he would die an early, unburied death. And she prayed for eternal enmity between her people and his. "Let there be no love between our peoples, and no treaties," she cried, "and from my bones let some avenger arise, to chase the Trojan settlers with fire and sword, now and in the future, whenever the strength is there. I pray that shore be opposed to shore, sea to sea, and sword to sword. Let them fight, both they and their descendants." With this curse, she had prophesied the centuries of brutal warfare between Carthage and Rome, the Punic Wars. Her personal tragedy had become a geopolitical cataclysm. She then climbed the great pyre. She took the Trojan sword that Aeneas had left behind, a final, cruel reminder of their love, and with a final, heartbreaking speech, she fell upon its blade. Her maids screamed, and the news of her death spread through the city like a fire. The great queen of Carthage, the brilliant founder of a new nation, was dead, a victim of a love that was fated to be a casualty of the grand, historical destiny of Rome. After the tragic departure from Carthage, the Trojan fleet was once again caught in a storm, which drove them back to the shores of Sicily, the very land where Aeneas had buried his father, Anchises, a year before. They held great funeral games in his honor, a solemn and athletic respite from their long journey. It was here that the Trojan women, weary of their endless 7-year wandering, were incited by Juno to try and burn the fleet, an act of desperate sabotage that was only stopped by a miraculous rainstorm sent by Jupiter. Aeneas, his spirit at its lowest ebb, was visited in a dream by the ghost of his father. Anchises told him not to fear, but to continue his journey. But first, he commanded, he must do something of immense importance. He must travel to Cumae, on the coast of Italy, and from there, descend into the underworld to speak with him. He told him that the prophetess of Apollo, the Sibyl, would be his guide. And so, Aeneas, leaving some of his weary followers behind to found a new city in Sicily, sailed on to Italy. He finally reached the shores of the promised land, at Cumae, a place of strange and wild beauty, dominated by the great temple of Apollo and the dark, yawning entrance to a massive cave. This was the home of the Cumaean Sibyl, one of the most feared and respected oracles in the ancient world. She was a mortal woman, but she was possessed by the god Apollo, her body a vessel for his divine prophecies. Aeneas went to the temple and prayed to the god, asking that the Trojans' long suffering might finally end and that they be allowed to settle in this new land. The Sibyl then became possessed. Her body convulsed, her face changed, and the voice that came from her was not her own, but the great, booming, and terrifying voice of the god. She gave him a dark and ambiguous prophecy. She foretold that he would reach the kingdom of Lavinium, but that he would wish he had never come. She saw wars, terrible wars, and the river Tiber foaming with blood. A new Achilles, she said, was already rising in Latium. His suffering was not over. It was just entering a new and more violent phase. Aeneas, unshaken, then made his great request. He asked the Sibyl to guide him down into the underworld, the realm of Dispater, so that he could see the face of his dear father once more. The Sibyl's expression became grave. She told him that the descent into Avernus was easy. The gates of dark Dis stood open day and night, but to retrace one's steps and escape back to the upper air, that was the difficult task. She told him that if he was truly set on this mad course, he must first find a sacred object, a golden bough, hidden deep within a nearby forest. This bough was sacred to Proserpina, the queen of the underworld, and it was the necessary passport for a living man to enter her kingdom. He had to find it and break it off its tree. If he was fated to go, it would come away easily in his hand. If not, no amount of force could break it. With this daunting task before him, Aeneas, guided by 2 doves sent by his mother Venus, entered the ancient, gloomy forest to search for the one magical key that would unlock the gates of the dead. Aeneas found the golden bough, and it came away easily in his hand. He brought it to the Sibyl, and together they made their way to the great, foul-smelling cavern that was the entrance to the underworld. After performing a sacrifice of black cattle to the gods of the dead, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and the Sibyl cried out that the time had come. They plunged into the darkness of the cave, a journey into the very throat of Orcus. The path was a descent into a world of shadows and personified horrors. They passed through the very vestibule of hell, where the spirits of grief, of worry, of disease, of old age, and of fear dwelled. They saw the monstrous forms of the centaurs, of Scylla, of the Hydra, and of the Chimera, all insubstantial phantoms that could not be harmed by a mortal sword. They came to the banks of the river Acheron, the great river of the underworld, where a vast, pathetic crowd of souls was gathered. These were the shades of the unburied, who were doomed to wander the banks for 100 years before they were allowed to cross. The grim ferryman, Charon, his eyes like furnaces, fended them off with his pole. When he saw Aeneas, a living man in armor, he challenged him. But the Sibyl showed him the golden bough, and the ferryman's anger was calmed. They boarded his creaking, spectral boat and were ferried across the dark water. On the other side, the great, 3-headed dog Cerberus began to bark, the snakes on its necks writhing. the Sibyl threw the beast a drugged honey cake, and it immediately fell into a deep sleep, allowing them to pass. They had now entered the true underworld, and it was divided into regions for different kinds of souls. First, they came to the fields of the infants who had died before their time. Then, they saw the souls of those who had been unjustly condemned to death. And then, they came to the Lugentes Campi, the mourning fields. Here dwelled the souls of those who had died for love, and among them, wandering in a great myrtle wood, Aeneas saw her. It was the shade of Dido. She was fresh from her wound, her face pale and sorrowful. Aeneas wept. He spoke to her, his voice filled with a desperate, heartbroken remorse. He swore that he had not left her of his own free will, that it was the commands of the gods that had forced him. But she did not answer. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground and would not look at him. She was as silent and unmoving as a piece of hard flint. Then she turned from him and fled into the shadows of the wood to be comforted by the ghost of her first husband, Zacchaeus. It was a final, devastating rejection, a confirmation that his duty had cost him everything. With a heavy heart, Aeneas continued his journey, leaving the ghosts of his tragic past behind him and moving towards the fields reserved for the great heroes of war. Leaving the mourning fields behind, Aeneas and the Sibyl journeyed onward to the fields reserved for the souls of great warriors. Here, he saw the ghosts of his fallen Trojan comrades, who gathered around him, eager to hear his story. He also saw the shades of the Greek heroes, who fled from him in terror, as if they were still on the battlefield of Troy. They then passed the great, triple-walled fortress of Tartarus, the prison of the damned. From within, Aeneas could hear the groans of the tormented, the crack of whips, and the dragging of chains. He saw the monstrous Hydra guarding its gates. The Sibyl described to him the terrible punishments being meted out to the great sinners within, the Titans, Tantalus, and Sisyphus. It was a place of eternal, divine justice, a vision of the fate he had avoided. Finally, they reached their destination. They placed the golden bough at the threshold of the palace of Proserpina and entered the blissful land of Elysium, the home of the blessed. This was a world of light and peace. It had its own sun and its own stars. The air was pure and filled with a golden light. The shades of the righteous here were not sad or insubstantial. They were happy, spending their eternity in joyful pursuits, in athletics, in dancing, and in song. And here, in a green and pleasant valley, Aeneas found him. It was his father, Anchises. The reunion was one of profound, tearful joy. Aeneas tried 3 times to embrace his father, but as with the ghost of Creusa, his arms passed through his father's ethereal form. Anchises was overjoyed to see his son, who had braved the terrors of the underworld to reach him. He then began to reveal to Aeneas the great purpose of his journey. He led him to a hill overlooking a great, flowing river, the river Lethe. Along its banks, a vast, innumerable crowd of souls was gathered. These, Anchises explained, were the souls who were destined to be reborn into the world above. But first, they had to drink the waters of Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, to wipe their minds clean of their past lives. Anchises then performed the greatest act of prophecy. He showed his son a great pageant of the souls who were waiting to be born into Roman bodies. He pointed them out one by one, a magnificent parade of the future heroes of Rome. He showed him Silvius, his own son who was yet to be born. He showed him Romulus, the great founder of the city, and then he showed him the great Julian line, culminating in the figure of Caesar Augustus, the emperor who would bring peace to the world and usher in a new golden age. He showed him the great kings, the consuls, the generals, all the men who would make Rome the ruler of the world. And as he showed him this vision of the future, he explained the unique destiny, the special mission of the Roman people. While other nations, like the Greeks, might excel in art or philosophy, the Roman genius would be for government, for law, and for empire. "Your task, Roman," Anchises declared, his voice ringing with the force of destiny. "Remember by your strength to rule Earth's peoples, for your arts are to be these: to pacify, to impose the rule of law, to spare the conquered, and to crush the proud." Aeneas was filled with a new, profound sense of purpose. His long personal journey of suffering had been transformed into a great historical mission. He now understood not just what he had to do, but why Aeneas, his spirit now fired with the vision of Rome's future glory, returned from the underworld with the Sibyl and rejoined his fleet. They sailed up the coast of Italy and finally reached the mouth of the river Tiber, the river that had been prophesied by Creus's ghost and by the god of the river himself. This was the place. This was Hesperia, the promised land. The local king of this land, Latium, was an old and wise man named Latinus. He had a daughter, his only child, named Lavinia. She was a beautiful maiden, and she had been betrothed to the most powerful of the local princes, a man named Turnus, the fierce and handsome king of the Rutuli. But a series of powerful and terrifying omens had made King Latinus uneasy. A swarm of bees had settled on a sacred laurel tree in his palace courtyard, a sign that a foreign army was coming. And when his daughter Lavinia was making a sacrifice, her hair and her clothes had caught fire, a blaze that did not harm her, but that foretold a glorious future for her and a great war for her people. Alarmed, King Latinus had consulted the oracle of his father, the deified Faunus. From deep within a sacred grove, the oracle had spoken, its voice echoing in the gloom. It warned him not to marry his daughter to a Latin suitor. "A foreigner will come," the oracle declared, "to be your son-in-law, and his blood will raise our name to the stars. The descendants of that stock will see the whole world turning under their feet and guided by their will." So when the Trojan ambassadors arrived at his court, King Latinus was prepared. He welcomed them with grace and hospitality, and when he heard their story and saw the gifts they brought, he knew that these were the men the prophecy had spoken of. He recognized Aeneas as the fated foreign prince. He immediately offered them land on which to build their new city, and, more importantly, he offered his daughter Lavinia's hand in marriage to Aeneas. It was a moment of incredible hope. The long journey was over. The prophecy was being fulfilled. A peaceful alliance seemed certain. But the gods, or rather one god, had other plans. The goddess Juno, watching from the heavens, was filled with a final convulsive rage. She could not stop the Trojans from reaching Italy, but she could still make their victory a bitter and a bloody one. She would not be denied her vengeance. "I have been defeated by Aeneas," she raged, "but I can still drag out the proceedings and throw in some delays. I can still destroy the people of both these kings." She descended from the heavens and summoned the most terrible of all her instruments of chaos. She opened the gates of hell and called forth Alecto, the most terrible of the three Furies, a goddess of eternal, implacable rage, whose heart was filled with a love of war, of strife, and of treachery. Juno gave her a simple, terrible command: shatter the peace and sow the seeds of a brutal, inescapable war, the Fury. Alecto, a creature of pure, venomous malice, flew to the earth, her snake-like hair hissing. Her mission was to poison the hearts of the key players in Latium and turn their nascent peace into a bloody war. Her first target was Queen Amata, the wife of King Letnus and the mother of Lavinia. The queen was already upset about the broken betrothal of her daughter to Turnus, whom she favored. Alecto crept into the palace, and taking one of the snakes from her hair, she threw it onto the queen's breast. The snake, a cold, slithering horror, glided over the queen's body, its venom not a physical poison, but a spiritual one, seeping into her very soul and filling her with a wild, uncontrollable rage. Queen Amata became a woman possessed. She pleaded with her husband, but he would not listen. So, in a mad frenzy, she took her daughter and fled into the woods, hiding her in the mountains and whipping the other Latin mothers into a Bacchic, wine-fueled rage. Her second target was Turnus, the proud Rutulian king whose bride had just been stolen from him. Alecto came to him in his sleep, disguised as an old priestess. She goaded him, calling him a coward for letting a foreign refugee steal his kingdom and his wife. When Turnus scornfully dismissed her, the Fury revealed her true form, her face a terrifying mask of rage, her eyes blazing, her snake hair writhing. She tore a burning torch from her hair and plunged it deep into his chest. Turnus awoke in a sweat, his heart filled with a monstrous, unquenchable lust for battle. His pride had been ignited into a furious, warlike rage. He immediately began to mobilize his armies. The final piece of Alecto's plan was to create an incident, an unforgivable act that would make the war inevitable. She guided Aeneas's young son, Aeneas, who was out hunting, towards a magnificent stag. This stag was not a wild animal. It was a beloved pet, raised by the daughter of the chief herdsman of King Latinus. It was tame and would wander through the local villages. Aeneas, seeing the beautiful animal and filled with a desire for glory, shot it with an arrow. The wounded stag, crying pitifully, dragged itself home to its mistress's cottage and died at her feet. The girl's cries of grief were heard by the other herdsmen. Alecto then sounded a terrible blast on a rustic horn, a sound that echoed through the hills and called all the local farmers and shepherds to arms. A small, bloody skirmish broke out between the furious Latins and the Trojans who had rushed to help Aeneas. Men were killed on both sides. The first blood had been shed. The bodies of the slain were carried back to the city of King Latinus, and the people, whipped into a frenzy by Turnus and the grieving families, clamored for war. The peace was shattered. The prophecy of the Sibyl had come true. The river Tiber was about to foam with blood. The war had begun. The tribes of Latium, their hearts filled with the poison of the Fury, began to gather their armies under the command of the great warrior, Turnus. Aeneas was now a stranger in a hostile land, his small band of Trojans vastly outnumbered. In his despair, he was visited in a dream by the god of the river Tiber himself, who rose from the water, a majestic old man draped in a sea-green cloak. The god reassured him, confirming that this was the promised land, and advised him to seek an alliance with the Arcadian king Evander, who had a settlement upstream on the future site of Rome itself. But Aeneas needed more than just allies. He needed to be armed like a hero. His mother, the goddess Venus, her heart aching with fear for her son, went to her husband, the god Vulcan, the master of the forge. She found him in his great workshop beneath the earth, where the Cyclopes were hammering out lightning bolts for Jupiter. She used all her powers of seduction and pleaded with him to forge a new set of armor for her mortal son, armor that would be worthy of his great destiny. Vulcan, unable to resist her charms, agreed. He and his Cyclopes worked through the night, their hammers ringing like thunder. They forged a magnificent suit of armor, a helmet with a flaming crest, a sword, greaves of polished bronze, and a spear. But the masterpiece was the shield. It was a work of divine art, a prophecy in metal. Vulcan, who had knowledge of the future, had embossed upon its surface the entire glorious history of Rome, the story of the nation that Aeneas was fighting to create. On the shield, Aeneas could see the story of his own descendants. He saw the she-wolf nursing the infants Romulus and Remus. He saw the rape of the Sabine women. He saw the great heroes of the Republic, Horatius at the bridge, and the geese that saved the capital. He saw the great naval battle of Actium, where his descendant, Augustus Caesar, would defeat Mark Antony and Cleopatra and bring peace to the world. And in the very center of the shield, he saw the great triumph of Augustus, the conquered nations of the world parading before him. Aeneas did not understand the details of these future events, but he was filled with awe and wonder at the sight. He lifted the great shield onto his shoulder, and in doing so, he was literally shouldering the fame and the fate of his descendants. He was no longer just a man fighting for his own survival. He was an instrument of destiny, the bearer of the future glory of Rome, armed by a god and ready to face the brutal war that would decide the fate of the world. The war in Latium was a brutal, grinding conflict, a series of bloody battles and heroic, tragic duels. It was not a simple story of good versus evil, but a sorrowful tale of two noble peoples, the Trojans and the Latins, forced into a conflict they did not want by the bitter machinations of a vengeful goddess. Aeneas, following the advice of the river god, sailed up the Tiber to the settlement of Pallanteum, the future site of Rome. There, he forged a crucial alliance with the Arcadian king, Evander. Evander, who was also an enemy of the Latins, agreed to help and entrusted his own beloved son, the young and heroic Prince Pallas, to Aeneas's care. Pallas would fight by the Trojan hero's side, learning the arts of war. While Aeneas was away, the Trojan camp was besieged by the armies of Turnus. The Trojans were trapped, their situation desperate. In one of the most famous and tragic episodes of the war, two young Trojan friends, Nisus and Euryalus, embarked on a daring night raid to try and get a message to Aeneas. They successfully slipped through the sleeping Latin lines, killing many of the enemy captains as they slept. But on their way back, they were spotted by a cavalry patrol. Euryalus, who was weighed down by the spoils he had taken, was captured. Nisus, who had at first escaped, ran back to try and save his friend, and both were killed. Their heads were impaled on spears and paraded before the walls of the Trojan camp, a grim and heartbreaking sight. Aeneas finally returned with his new Arcadian allies, his arrival turning the tide of the battle. The fighting was fierce and personal. Aeneas, a storm of righteous fury on the battlefield, killed many of the Latin heroes. But the war also brought him great sorrow. In the heat of the battle, The young Prince Pallas, whom Aeneas had sworn to protect, was killed by Turnus. Turnus, in an act of supreme arrogance, stripped the boy's sword belt from his body and wore it as a trophy. Aeneas was consumed by a grief that turned into a terrible, cold rage. His fight was no longer just for destiny. It was now for vengeance. The war was filled with such personal tragedies. The great Etruscan tyrant Mezentius, an ally of Turnus, was killed by Aeneas. His young son, Lausus, in a heroic act of filial piety, threw himself in front of Aeneas to save his father, and was also killed. Aeneas, seeing the boy's devotion, was filled with a moment of profound pity, a brief flash of humanity in the midst of the slaughter. The conflict raged on. The fields of Latium soaked with the blood of heroes, each death a personal tragedy, each act of violence a sorrowful step on the path to the founding of a new, great nation. The relentless slaughter had taken its toll on both armies. The fields were littered with the dead, and the air was heavy with the lamentations of the living. The Latin people, who had been whipped into a frenzy for war, now saw the terrible cost. Their initial anger had cooled into a profound war weariness. They had lost many of their finest warriors, and the promise of a quick victory had dissolved into a brutal, bloody stalemate. King Latinus, his heart broken by the division and death among his people, called a council of the Latin leaders. In the great hall, bitter recriminations flew. Some of the lords, who had been against the war from the beginning, blamed Turnus's pride and his personal ambition for their suffering. They argued that the Trojans were a fated people, and that it was folly to continue to resist them. They urged that the original agreement be honored, that Aeneas should marry Lavinia, and the war should end. Turnus, his pride wounded, responded with a fiery speech. He defended his honor and his courage, and he refused to back down. But he also understood that the war could not continue like this. He declared that he was willing to end the conflict in the manner of the heroic age. The war was, at its heart, a dispute between him and Aeneas over the hand of Lavinia and the future of the kingdom. Therefore, he proposed, he would meet Aeneas in single combat. The fate of their two peoples would be decided by a duel between their two champions. Let the winner take the bride and the kingdom. King Latinus and the other lords agreed. A truce was declared. The two armies would put down their weapons and act as witnesses to the great duel. An altar was set up on a great plain between the two camps, and solemn oaths were sworn to the gods. The terms were clear. If Turnus was victorious, the Trojans would withdraw peacefully and found a city elsewhere. If Aeneas was victorious, the Trojans and the Latins would unite as one people under a new shared name. The Trojans would not impose their rule on the Latins. They would live together as equals. It was a just and honorable solution, a chance to end the bloodshed and forge a lasting peace. The two heroes prepared for the final, fateful confrontation. Aeneas, clad in his divine armor, was a figure of grim, fated resolve. Turnus, in his own magnificent armor, was a picture of proud, fiery courage. The two armies gathered on opposite sides of the plain, a silent, anxious audience to the duel that would not just decide a war, but would determine the very character of the nation that was to be born from its ashes. The morning of the duel dawned, clear and bright. The two armies stood in silent formation. The altars were ready. But the peace was a fragile one. The goddess Juno, unable to accept the fated outcome, decided to make one last desperate attempt to save Turnus and thwart the Trojans. She sent Turnus's divine sister, the nymph Juturna, to break the truce. Juturna, in disguise, moved among the Latin soldiers, whispering words of shame and doubt, urging them not to stand by while their champion fought alone for their honor. She then created a false omen in the sky, an eagle that was attacked by a flock of smaller birds, a sign that a united force could overwhelm a single hero. The Latin soldiers, their hearts already on edge, were easily incited. One of them hurled a spear into the Trojan ranks, and the truce was shattered. A chaotic general battle erupted once more across the plain. Aeneas, horrified, tried to stop his men, to restore the order of the duel. But as he shouted for them to hold back, a stray arrow struck him in the leg, wounding him deeply and forcing him to retreat from the field. With Aeneas gone, Turnus raged across the battlefield like a storm, his confidence restored, cutting down Trojan after Trojan. The battle was once again turning in his favor, but Aeneas was not defeated. His mother, Venus, seeing her son's plight, intervened. She brought a magical healing herb from Mount Ida, and with it, the Trojan healers were able to miraculously cure his wound. Aeneas returned to the battle, his strength restored, his heart now filled with a final, terrible resolve. He would no longer play by the rules. He would end this now. He led his army in a direct assault on the city of King Latinus itself, setting its towers on fire. Queen Amata, seeing the city in flames and believing that Turnus was dead, fell into despair and hanged herself. Turnus, hearing the cries from the city and seeing it burning, finally understood that the time for delay was over. He rushed to find Aeneas, calling for the battle to cease, for the duel to finally take place. The two heroes met at last in a clearing amidst the chaos. The final combat was a battle of titans. They fought with a fury born of destiny and despair. Jupiter himself held up his golden scales, placing the fate of each hero in the balance. Aeneas's fate rose, and Turnus's sank. Turnus's mortal sword shattered against Aeneas's divine armor. He was forced to flee, with Aeneas pursuing him relentlessly. Finally, Aeneas struck him in the thigh with his great spear, wounding him and bringing him to his knees. The great Rutulian king, proud and defeated, looked up at his conqueror. He did not beg for his own life, but for the sake of his old father, he asked that his body be returned for a proper burial. Aeneas hesitated. The plea had touched him. He was on the verge of showing mercy. But then his eyes fell upon the sword belt that Turnus was wearing. It was the belt of the young Prince Pallas, the boy he had sworn to protect, whom Turnus had killed and despoiled. The sight of it reignited his grief and his rage. "Shall you, decked in the spoils of my friend, escape me?" he roared, his voice thick with fury. "It is Pallas who strikes this blow, Pallas who sacrifices you and exacts the penalty from your guilty blood." And with that, he plunged his sword deep into Turnus's chest. The hero's life fled, with a groan, down to the shades. The war was over. The future of Rome was secured.